We've all seen lions, tigers, and bears, but most people haven't seen an animal that contains DNA of all three. It's actually possible for certain animal species to be interbred and procreate strange-looking hybrid animals. Today, we'll be taking a look at 15 of the most scary hybrid animals. Number 15. Liger. While we were all laughing as Napoleon Dynamite was drawing pictures of the mythical liger in his notebook, scientists were laughing at us because the liger is very real. It's one of the most well-known hybrids to exist, but don't expect to see one on the hunt in the savannah. This artificially created beast only exists in the zoos and sanctuaries that have birthed them. And as the name would suggest, they're the product of a male lion mating with a female tiger. But the kicker here is that these animals grow to be much larger than either of their parents. And while this may sound cool to us, it's actually quite unfortunate for the ligers. They suffer from a bout of gigantism, which causes them to weigh around 1,200 pounds, which is way too much for their body to even attempt to support. So the odds of seeing one running around even in an enclosure are slim to none. So while on paper the idea of a liger is awesome, they live somewhat of a sad existence. Because they're so overweight, it's too much for their body, organs, and heart to take. Most of them die at a young age. But the ligers are fertile, and although uncommon, they can mate with other ligers, tigers, and lions. But that offspring seems even scarier than the liger itself. Number 14. Jaglion. Lions are scary enough in their own right, and so the thought of combining them with a jaguar is downright terrifying. Both of these animals are at the top of the food chain and stalk their prey before going in for the kill. And when you combine these two apex predators, you get the jaglion. A product of an incredibly selective breeding system, the jaglion is incredibly rare and will always be birthed at an animal sanctuary. But one of the most famous jaglions lived in the Bear Creek Sanctuary in Ontario, Canada, and will likely live out their days there, toting the line between lion and jaguar. But their birth was actually a happy accident. A black jaguar had mated with a lioness, and thus these twins were born, and their caretakers have said that these two are inseparable. It's highly unlikely that they would be accepted by either species in the wild, and because they can't breed with other species of their own, they are essentially one-of-a-kind creatures. But one thing you can't deny is they're incredibly gorgeous, taking on the best physical traits of each animal. But if there's one lesson you can learn from nature, it's that the more beautiful the animal, the chances are the deadlier it is. Just make sure you don't turn your back on them, because that's when they strike. Number 13. Growler bear. When you're camping, the last thing you want to run into is a grizzly bear. If one of these things takes a liking to you, things probably won't pan out so well. So what would happen if one of these giant predators had their genes crossed with their polar cousins? Well, then you've got a growler bear on your hands. The name may be silly, but the growler bear is not to be trifled with. And unlike previous entries, these are more likely to turn up in the wild than in a zoo or sanctuary. Back in 2006, an odd-looking bear was shot in the Canadian Arctic, and after some DNA testing and plenty of head-scratching, it was confirmed that this was in fact a hybrid animal. So how does something like this even happen? Don't grizzlies and polar bears have their own respective territories? This one is a little sadder, and it's likely that these two bears came across each other due to climate change. As we all know, polar bears have been running out of space in the Arctic regions, so they've been moving south into grizzly country, and you can figure out the rest from there. But since that initial sighting, more and more hunters are reporting growler bear sightings, and it's likely that there will be even more in the future. Number 12. Zonkey. A zonkey is not a zombie donkey, but the fact that this hybrid animal exists is creepy enough. When you mix a zebra with a donkey, you get the strange cocktail that is the zonkey. And because both animals are equine, breeding two successfully is pretty easy to do. But the chances of a zebra and a donkey falling in love with each other in the wild are pretty low. So you can bet that any zonkey in existence is a product of both science and selective breeding. And luckily, much like its parents, the zonkey is anything but deadly, unless killing somebody with cuteness is a thing. The zonkey is able to retain traits from both parents that give it its coat, and so they'll typically have zebra lines on their legs, but they'll still give you that iconic hee-haw if you get a little too close. Perhaps they've retained the best of both worlds then. But the only catch with the zonkey is that these guys are a one-time deal, meaning they can't produce any young, making each iteration one of a kind. And if you ever get down to Tijuana and see a fully striped zonkey, chances are it's just a donkey with those black and white stripes painted on. But if you want to catch a glimpse of this wild hybrid, your best bet is going to be at a special zoo. Number 11. Humpless Camel. If you're lucky enough to see a camel in person or even ride one, the first thing you're going to notice is the hump. But what about humpless camels? Also known as camas, humpless camels are the product of a camel breeding with a llama. And while you may not realize it, llamas and camels aren't that too far from each other in the gene pool, so this hybrid animal isn't as rare or tough to create. This is an interesting animal because while it may look like a small camel, you'll immediately notice the hump is missing. But they do take on the llama's coat, meaning they are extra soft. While not as large as a camel, an adult cama can weigh up to 6 times as much as a llama. But because these can only be made via artificial insemination, you'll never see one out in the wild. Plus, think about where each animal lives in relation to the other. That just can't happen. The very first cama on record was bred in 1998, with the goal of producing more wool than your straight-up llama because of its size and more cooperative temperament. So originally, llamas were too small and camels were too tough, and in just 10 years, another 5 camas were produced. Number 10. Beefalo. Humans love beef. We love burgers, and steaks maybe a little too much sometimes, and it can feel like there aren't enough cows to satiate our appetites. So naturally, scientists are always thinking of ways to really beef things up, which is why they created the Beefalo. The product of a human-led breeding program, you get a beefalo when you mix a male cow and a female bison. And unlike some of the other hybrids we've seen, the history of the beefalo goes back a few hundred years. The first recorded beefalo sighting was in 1749, when they were accidentally bred in the American South. But about 100 years later, settlers began creating beefalo in the hopes that they would provide both more milk than cows and survive the harsh winters. Think of them as super cows. The beefalo was tough to manage, but they were a success nonetheless because the majority of them were able to produce offspring. But cut to a few centuries later, the meat industry is booming and manufacturers are employing scientists to help them produce more and better meat. So now, the beefalo comes in again, offering not just more meat, but leaner and with less fat and cholesterol than your average cattle. It's an odd animal with an odd history, and perhaps even an odder future. Number 9. Hinny. If you thought the zonkey was one freaky hybrid animal, then just wait until you hear about this one. The hinny is a product of a match made anywhere but heaven, a female donkey mating with a male horse, and so the hinny is essentially the opposite of a mule and looks much smaller than its well-known cousin. But instead of being a smaller, more demure hybrid animal, this one is strong, really strong. Hinny have some tough legs, so despite their size, they can give you just a little more bang for your buck than the average pack animal. It's quite an interesting characteristic, and unlike the mule, the hinny is a little easier on the eyes, with a more and overall better-looking mane. So, the hinny has beauty and brawn, but how about brains? Well, maybe not so much. It may not be the sharpest tool in the shed, but they certainly know how to get the job done. The biggest question here is, why do you get a mule when you cross a male donkey with a female horse, but a hinny when you have the inverse pair? It all comes down to the dominant traits of the mother. So, because the hinny's mother is much smaller than the horse that sired it, you get this small in stature hybrid animal. Number 8. The Zoo. Sure, a lot of hybrid animals are the products of lab creations and the want for newer zoo attractions. But then there are those that are made out of necessity, and that's exactly what the zoo is. It's what you get when you mix a yak with a domestic cow, and it's easily one of the most useful hybrids around. The zoo has become all the rage amongst farmers in the hills of Mongolia and Tibet, as they make not only excellent beasts of burden, but they've also become a bit of a delicacy, offering the best of both worlds when it comes to the meat. But what really makes the zoo so special is its sheer size, because neither a cattle nor a yak can achieve that size naturally. And fun little fact about the zoo is that females are all fertile and capable of further producing offspring. But when it comes to the males, they're a one-time deal. The male zoo is totally infertile, so you better enjoy those genes while you can. The zoo is a great example of what happy accidents can yield, as well as the brains and creativity of everyday folk, as opposed to men and women in lab coats cooking up Frankenstein monsters for research purposes. Number 7. Spider goats. Okay, you've heard of Spider-Man, but what about spider goats? Spider goats are very real and a new addition into the world of living oddities created by science. But instead of swinging from building to building and saving the city once a week, all these goats do is produce milk that contains spider silk. But because these goats have had their DNA spliced with the golden orb spider, the silk from the milk can be extracted and used to make all kinds of amazingly strong materials like parachutes, fishing lines, and even body armor. These spider goats are totally amazing and seriously unusual, but don't expect to find silk milk on the shelves of your local grocery store anytime soon, because they're strictly bred and farmed for science. And if you don't believe me, just reach out to the University of Utah and they'd be happy to show off these amazing spider goats on one of their many guided tours. And always just remember that with great power comes great responsibility, even for goats. Number 6. Wolfen. Alright, this next entry of wacky hybrids is probably one of the rarest in the world, which is saying a lot, and probably one of the coolest too. The wolfen is what you get when you cross a female bottlenose dolphin and a male false killer whale, which is actually a member of the dolphin family and not an actual killer whale. Just imagine what that would look like. But the wolfen is a super cool hybrid that does in fact exist in the wild, and more people have been seeing them, albeit still far and few between. But of course, this is the type of animal that you'd mostly find in captivity, with the first being produced in Tokyo SeaWorld in 1981, who unfortunately died after just 200 days. The first wolfen in the United States was birthed at the Sea Life Park in Hawaii in 1985, named Kekaimalu, which means from the peaceful ocean, and she was a hit from the moment she was born. And it's not hard to see why, with her darker skin, nice row of 66 razor-sharp pearly whites that she shows off with every wide smile. She was even able to produce offspring, which sadly passed away after just a few days. But her second calf lives a far more successful life, living to be about 9 years old. It's safe to say that the wolfen still needs some genetic fine-tuning to become a mainstay within the animal kingdom. Number 5. Geep. Not to be confused with the four-wheeled Grand Cherokee, the geep is a funny little hybrid animal made when a sheep and a goat successfully procreate. But that pairing doesn't always work out, and many geeps are never carried to term and come out as stillborn. So like some previous list entries, the geep is a rare find. So if you do manage to catch a glimpse of one, consider yourself to be incredibly lucky, because these little guys are cute as hell. The very first case on record of one of these little hybrid babies being born dates back to the year 2000, when a male sheep impregnated a female goat at the Botswana Ministry of Agriculture. The baby geep was born with a coarser outer coat and beautiful woolly inner coat, and it came with the legs of a sheep and the body of a goat. It sounds a bit like a mythological creature, but much to the chagrin of the caretakers, it was totally real. Sadly though, like many hybrid animals, the geep is infertile, so the idea of an entire flock of geep running around in the meadow is just a pipe dream. But while he couldn't create any offspring, the geep in Botswana would go for anything that moved, chasing after every female sheep that he came across within the facility. You go, geep. Number 4. Green Sea Slug. Claiming the number 4 spot on this list of hybrid animals is probably the most unusual yet. It's none other than the green sea slug. This slug is a strange little beast, incorporating the genetic material from the algae that it eats into its own DNA. So talk about you are what you eat. It's one of the few animals on Earth with this characteristic, and floats about in the oceans looking like a big green plant. But because the slug feeds on plants, it uses photosynthesis to create its own nutrients as well, which is what gives it its bright green color. Scientists have even called it the emerald green Elysia. So instead of being the product of two different animals, the green sea slug is made up of everything, everywhere, all at once. It's pretty crazy, and it's still baffling scientists around the world. Research is still underway as to how the green sea slug is able to do what it does. And as of yet, this amazing slug is the only successful instance of gene transfer from one type of complex organism into another. You'll typically find these guys hanging out in the shallows of tidal or salt marshes and creeks. So the next time you're hanging around in those areas and see some bright green leaves floating about in the water, there's a chance that it's actually a green sea slug hiding in plain sight. Number 3. Taigan. Very similar to the liger, the taigan has the same parents, only this time the roles are reversed. The taigan is the epic offspring of a male tiger and a female lion or lioness. But it is amazing how, despite having such similar parentage, the taigan looks so different from its gender-swapped counterparts. These hybrid animals are absolutely gorgeous, with their light tan stripes and a nice white underbelly, all topped off with a big mane and spotted head. And as you could probably guess by now, there's no way that a tiger and lion are mating in the wild. Tigers are incredibly solitary, with their domains spanning for miles and miles, and lions mainly sticking to their pride. On the off chance that these two animals came across each other in the wild, the odds are it wouldn't end well. So the taigan is only ever going to be found in captivity. And there's no way these hybrids could ever be released into the wild, because they would sadly never be accepted by either species. But such is the life of a hybrid animal, I suppose. The taigan's history dates all the way back to 1943, when one was successfully birthed at the Munich Hellebrunn Zoo and even raised to adulthood. And while there have been just a handful of exceptions, the majority of the taigans you'll come across at your local zoo are sterile, meaning each one is both the first and last of their family. Number 2. A lepin. Ligers and taigans and growler bears, oh my! And if you thought those were freaky hybrids, then just wait until you see this one. When a male leopard successfully mates with a female lion, you get the lepin. These hybrids are animals that are rare, with only a handful ever to exist, all of whom were bred in captivity. The lepin has both a unique and beautiful appearance, and looks like something Hercules came across during his 12 labors. The lepin has the head of a lion, a beautiful mane, deadly jaws and all, but with the spotted body of the leopard. If this thing ever got out into the wild, there's no doubt that it would be the apex predator and absolutely dominate the jungles and savannas of the world as it blends into its surroundings, stalking its prey. But luckily for us, that's never going to happen. The world's very first lepin was bred in India at the turn of the 20th century, and now more than 100 years later, it's believed that there are only about 100 in existence today. The minute one of these lepins are born, they enter the endangered species list. It's one strange yet beautiful existence. Number 1. Killer bees. We'll bet you didn't know that killer bees are actually hybrid animals. That's right, these horrifying little fuzzy, buzzing creatures are actually the product of human interference. Created back in the 1950s, scientists were putting their heads together with the goal of increasing the world's honey production, so they bred a few different species of bee. They took the typical honeybee and mixed them up with the African bee in a lab in Brazil. The result was a big bee with a nasty attitude that was supposed to live out its days in a controlled environment. Too bad for the scientists, though, and the rest of the world, that these new hybrid bees broke loose. And unlike so many hybrid animals, the killer bee is very, very capable of producing not just honey, but offspring. Their defining characteristic is their strong will to defend the colony at all costs. And unless you're deathly allergic, the sting of one killer bee won't be too much. But the thing is, you never just see one killer bee on its own. These deadly little insects love to hang out in swarms, and if you ever come across one, there's no way you can outrun them on just 2 legs. This is one hybrid animal that you want to steer clear of at all costs. Watch our Animals playlist for more top 15 videos about animals. Sit back, relax, and binge watch all of our best animal-related videos.